Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade, where today, somewhat unusually, we are not going to the battlefront. Neither to the core word assault or the primary assault. Instead, we are going way back in the Sabbat worlds, to a planet touched by the Imperial Crusade many, many years ago. We are going back to Balhut. The site, of course, of the Imperium's perhaps single greatest victory so far in the Crusade, the turning point, where a stalled Imperial Crusade was transformed and reinvigorated yet again into a glorious pursuit of what everyone expected to be a defeated enemy. That, of course, didn't quite work out the way that the Imperium had hoped for, but nevertheless, or perhaps despite of this fact, Balhut held a place of particular significance in the heart of the Imperial Crusade, being both the battlefield where the infernal Archon of the arch-enemy Nadzibar was finally brought to justice and righteously dispatched by the victorious arms of the God Emperor, but also the final resting place of the visionary who had made the Crusade possible in the first place, War Master Sladeau. Due to this dual significance, and the Crusade going on for longer than many had hoped and anticipated, Balhut had become an important world for different reasons than merely the strategic. It had become a touchstone, a place of memorial and reverence. Nobles from the Khan worlds would flock to Balhut to see the final resting place of War Master Sladeau, the savior of their own system, and a creature of almost mythological significance to the Khan group. Many others came to visit the graves of lost loved ones, as the Khan groups had been a large central rallying point for the creation of many Imperial Guard regiments that would follow Sladeau into the Sabbat worlds. Many others came from yet further afield, having followed in the footstep of a prominent relative. Perhaps distant nobility had an uncle or a cousin serving as an officer in one of the countless Imperial Guard regiments that invaded the Sabbat worlds. Having such a hero in the family would of course impart great gravitas upon the rest of the familiar lineage. Being seen to be closer, therefore, to such a heroic figure would no doubt be great help in local politics. Yet others again simply ventured to Balhut because it was the site of a great Imperial victory, wanting to see the sights and experience the world for themselves. Not to mention, of course, billions upon billions of pilgrims streaming into the Sabbat worlds after the news of the resurrected saint became more commonly known in the rest of the Imperium, passing through the planet rather than stopping on it. And then there were the dead, arriving on Balhut by their uncountable trillions. The world had not merely become the final resting spot, you see, for those who fell in its liberation. Due to the world's significance and its particular history, it had become a popular final destination for many officers and men of means or accomplishment who had fallen in the God Emperor's service in the Sabbat worlds, being transported back at significant expense to be interned into enormous mausoleums, many of which were even now still being built or in the process of being constructed or planned out, as Balhut was slowly turning into a bit of a mortuary world, where the caring for the dead or the preparation for their arrival was a swiftly growing industry amongst its population. And of course, there were also many more less deserving soldiers that were to be buried in the hallowed earth of Balhut as well. Those who were not of a higher class and who could not afford such luxury either by themselves or from their family's side, but who would instead be granted at least the small mercy of being interned in vast military cemeteries, or occasionally, if for example only pieces of the deceased could be discovered, in huge communal tombs, mass graves with a little bit of extra frill to make the practice a pinch more palatable. But it wasn't just the dead who were returning to Balhut. Due to its strategic position at the heart of many a stable warp route, the world had once been a central hub of administration for the Sabbat worlds, before they had fallen to chaos. And now that a significant portion of those very selfsame worlds had been reconquered by the Imperium, Balhut was yet again resuming its duties as a center for travel, for rest and recuperation, for Imperial intelligence, and the armies of bureaucrats that always follow in the God Empress soldiers' footsteps. It was the R&R part, the rest and relaxation bit, that saw the Tanith first and only arrive on Balhut for the first time. As, of course, pretty much everyone in the regiment had never been there before, with a handful of exceptions such as Colonel-Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, who had been a part of the original invasion force alongside the Hyrcan 8th. The Colonel-Commissar's reward for his heroics that day was supposed to be the command of several regiments of Tanith. But, well, due to the intervention of a Chaos raiding force, he barely got out with one overstrength regiment, which had since been through the meat grinder more than once, and despite reinforcements both on Verghast and later on Anachron Sextus, the regiment had taken a beating again and again and again. And the worst of all of these beatings had happened just recently on a planet by the name of Jago, a particularly cursed world where the Tanith First and Only had been sent up into a large mountain range to occupy a series of pre-Imperium fortifications. They had been dispatched to do this under the orders of Van Voights, who, well, didn't tell the Tanith the complete story as to why they were sent up into the mountains. They were originally informed that they would be carrying out scouting duties, occupying a position just in case the archenemy decided on some kind of a flanking move. Entirely unlikely, of course, but just in case. Van Voights had been underselling things somewhat. A lot, in fact. His own armies were engaged in a desperate all-out struggle with the primary strength of the arch-enemy's forces on the planet, and his flank was hanging in thin air, completely unprotected and with virtually no reserves whatsoever to speak of. If the arch-enemy swung around the mountain chain and struck Van Voights and his men from that direction, his army was as good as doomed. And that's why he placed the Tanith on his flank. They had by now developed quite the reputation for being able to pull off the kind of miracles that nobody else would be expected to do. Furthermore, they were not really a main frontline formation. They would be ill at ease in the hammering, battering tank melee of the main front, but occupying positions on the crucial flank of the main army, where they might not run into anything, well, It was a perfect situation as far as Von Voigt was concerned. If they didn't find anything, then he'd only sent off 2,000 to 3,000 light infantry, of little use in the main clash anyways. And if they did run into something, it was likely to be one hell of a something. The kind of something that only a regiment like the Tanith were likely to be able to hold off. And of course, there was indeed something coming. An enormous blood pact force, as the archenemy had apparently lured Von Voigt onto their main strength, intending to sideswipe him and eradicate him with a vast flanking formation. And the Tanith were indeed just the right regiment to occupy a position called Hinsa House, the house at the end of the world, as the Tanith described it, and block the advance of the Blood Pact. Fortunately, this was not their final battle, although it very easily could have been. The Blood Pact formation was far too large to be properly stopped by the Tanith, who did not even have access to the resupply required to keep themselves combat operational. They didn't have enough munitions, they didn't have enough food, nor enough water, and by the time additional support could be reserved and rallied to them, the Blood Pact had already managed to surround the fortress that the Tanith were now occupying, making it virtually impossible for them to receive the resupplies of ammunition and water. The entire regiment was eventually reduced to fighting with bayonets, knives, and bludgeons rather than lasguns. And as the last dregs of their ammunition reserves were depleted, it was only through a stroke of luck and genius that they managed to discover a cache of locally produced weapons and their ammunition. We shan't call them Xenos weapons and ammunition, because if we did, then that, of course, would impugn the honor of the Tanith first and only. No. They merely rediscovered a lost cache of, exotic wall guns, yes, that aided them in holding off the Blood Pact assault for just long enough for the Kanagas 52nd Mechanized, a full major force of 20,000 men, to reach them through the mountain passes and assume positions within Hinsa House and its surrounding terrain to block and bloodily repulse the Blood Pact force. But before their arrival, of course, the Tanith had to stand alone against the enemy, suffering severe casualties, including, it was thought for a very long time, Colonel-Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt himself, who had been taken by the enemy during one of their countless storms of the Hinsa House fortifications. He had been dragged away for interrogation, torture, and undoubtedly execution. The command of the Tanith first and only fell to Major Ron, who was now the second in command of the regiment after the passing of Colm Korbeck quite some whiles ago. However, Gaunt was not actually dead, and due to the heroic efforts of Scout Sergeant McCall and Gaunt's bodyguard, I suppose, life ward Ezra Knight, his body, as that is really what you'd have to call it at that point, was recovered. He had been tortured severely, his skin flayed, and his eyes plucked out. Gaunt was hours away from death at best had he continued to remain in Blood Pact captivity. Only the remarkable resilience of the Colonel-Commissar had seen him last for as long as he already had. And in many ways, his ragged, bloodied form was a perfect representation of the entirety of the Tanith regiment at the end of that action, which also saw the return of the hero of Herodor, Orgun Sorek, who had of course been handed into the hands of Imperial authorities after it was revealed that he was an unlicensed psyker, He had been turned into a psychic weapon by the Imperium, who had tried to communicate with the Tanith first and only, having been able to sense them with his vastly improved psychic powers. He had attempted to communicate with them, but had instead caused quite a bit of funny happenings. I will not tell you too much about it, because here's the thing. Only in Death is, in my opinion, probably the single best book in the entirety of the Gaunt's Ghost series, and I cannot recommend it enough, which is why I'm keeping it somewhat light on the details here. Ogun Sorik's service, torturous though it had long now been after his surrender, was finally ended on Yago by the bolt pistol of Commissar Hark, the very man who had condemned him to this existence in the first place. It was, of course, a by-the-book execution, as the now sanctioned Psyker Ogun Sorik had been acting above and beyond his official duties and remit. Anywho, after the action, the Colonel-Commissar was reconstructed with all the arts and crafts of Imperial medicine, Van Voigt's personally coming to visit him in the hospital ward and assuring him that he would receive the finest prosthetic replacements for his eyes that had been plucked out by his captors. The Colonel-Commissar was not exactly in a forgiving mood at the time, however, and Van Voigt apparently felt quite bad for the damage that he had indirectly inflicted on his friend and his regiment. And in all due likelihood, this was also the reason why the Tanith and the Colonel-Commissar were finally routed off the line and back into reserves, being sent back to Balhut, where it would be rested, relaxed, and reformed, and their commander, put back together again. It was long overdue, frankly, as the Tanith had been on the line for 12 years, non-stop, with virtually no opportunity for recuperation. It was no doubt a great relief for the Colonel, and many of his men as well, that they would be finally given an opportunity to do so. Although, it did swiftly become clear that the Tanith were, no garrison force. They started acting out, fairly quickly, actually. Disciplinary cases shot through the roof, and many, even including senior commanders, began plotting things to alleviate their boredom, to the point where Gaunt himself was beginning to pray to any power that would listen that their orders to return to the front line would arrive sooner rather than later, lest his regiment tear itself apart. Yeah. The Tanith were not made to sit on their asses for extended periods of time, it seems. And an opportunity may very well be arriving, as after one of his daily sojourns at the officers' club on Balhut, Gaunt was waylaid on his way back to his billets by the commissariat. Not in a bad way, mind you, but rather because they had a very special proposition, a mission for him. They had managed to capture what they believed to be a senior member of the Blood Pact, somebody who called himself Mabon Etogaur. Imperial intelligence had of course attempted to extract as much information from the man as possible, who had apparently surrendered himself into Imperial custody. But they had proven largely unsuccessful in, drawing anything at all from the man. He had proven remarkably, as in unusually, unnaturally resilient against any form of persuasion that the Imperium's interrogators could levy against him, be it physic or psychological torture or any other tool, be it drugs, chemicals, hallucination, manipulation, you name it, nothing was working. Now, the servants of the arch-enemy are often resistant to enhanced interrogation, because they've usually been through some shit themselves in their lives, and if it is indeed a legitimate possibility that the curse upon your soul inscribed on your very spine stating that if you betray your masters in any way, then a demonic monstrosity will gently but determinedly chew on your bone marrow for the next 5,000 years, well, that is ample motivation to keep shut. Although, in this case, it might not be quite that, as the prisoner had asked specifically for an Imperial officer, Ibrahim Gaunt of the Tanith, first and only. And if he was just allowed to meet with the Imperial Commissar, then he would tell the Imperial interrogators anything and everything they wanted. Gaunt was, of course, immediately rather suspicious about this for multiple reasons. One, the man had not given them their name. Not quite. Mabun was probably at least part of his name, but Eto Gaur was his rank, the rough equivalent of a general or higher officer. Secondly, the Imperial intelligence officers had judged the man to be blood pact, but this too was incorrect. Gaunt was able to deduce this by the fact that his hands were smooth, without a single blemish or ritual scar. The ritual scar that all blood pact take when joining the pact. They cut their hands open on the Gaur's very own armor. That's the entire idea of the blood pact. And the fact that this man had now smooth and unblemished hands meant that either he had never been a blood pact at all, which seemed very unlikely, or that he had been blood pact but had received extensive surgery and or replacement hands to cover up the ritual scars. Now, we, of course, remember this Eto Gaur from a previous point in our story, on Geryon. This was the very self-same commander who had spoken to the traitor Imperial General, and had seemed very fascinated by the Imperium, by the Imperium's military, and by the Imperium's faith. Furthermore, Mabun had then been in the service not of the Gaur, but of the Anarch, as one of the individuals training his sons of Sek. So, technically, it would be more appropriate to say that this man was a son, rather than a member of the Blood Pact. But of course, he would still be a repository of incredible intelligence for the Imperium. There were many secrets hidden away within that head of his, to the point where Imperial intelligence was willing to bring in a third party from outside. Now, the Colonel-Commissar was still a commissar, of course, so it's not like they were pulling in some rando from the street, but Imperial intelligence tends to be very jealous when it comes to hoarding their resources and secrets, so this was a remarkable move from them. What was even more remarkable was the nature of the intelligence that the prisoner, as the Commissariat now called him, Prisoner B, was purporting to possess. After meeting, as he requested, with Colonel-Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, Mabun stated that he had information that would allow the Imperium to win the war in the Sabbat worlds. That was a big promise, and explained largely why the Commissariat was taking such a large risk as to bring in somebody not directly associated with their intelligence gathering efforts in on this operation, even as they had kept others out of it. One of these others being Handro Rhyme, an Inquisitor, and one of many bringing a bad name to the Inquisitors in the Sabbat worlds, but we'll get to that a fair bit later. The Commissariat had not seen fit to inform the Inquisition, or any other arm of Imperial intelligence, mind you, that they possessed Prisoner B, nor of course any details as to his capture or the potential secrets that he held within his skull. But if the Imperium was ever in any doubt as to the validity and the value of aforementioned secrets, then that doubt was soon to be dispelled, as a giant red monster slammed its way into the Commissariat headquartered on Balhut and started indiscriminately butchering everyone. As far as confirmations go, this was certainly a rather strident one, as it appears the archenemy had dispatched a special assassination team all the way to Balhut, guaranteeing their own demise, of course, by doing so, just to silence this guy. And it wasn't just the monster either, a so-called blood wolf, a ritual where a demon soul was bound into the body of a blood pact soldier, turning him into a frenzied bestial creature, capable of enormous destruction in very short time before the entire thing would burn out and pop. It required, of course, the sacrifice of one of the members of the Blood Pact strike team, their most devoted of all. The rest of the group would then follow in his wake and hopefully take charge of Prisoner B and killing him as quickly as they could, before then making a final stand against Imperial retaliation. Their plan, however, had not taken into account the presence of the Inquisitor, who had with him the tools to at least slow down the demonic creature, and the presence of Colonel-Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, who immediately took Prisoner B with him and effected an escape from the Commissariat. Unfortunately, Mabon had taken a round in the escape. He was severely wounded, and the Colonel-Commissar had to find some way to treat him immediately, but he also had no idea who he could truly trust anymore. Clearly, the Blood Pact strike team had known exactly where the Mabon was. This meant they had information from very deep within the Commissariat, or within some other form of Imperial intelligence. The Blood Pact troop was also apparently tracking them, and Gaunt had no real idea why. He could try to make it back to the Tanith barracks, but that was a long drive indeed, with a bleeding out Mabon in the back seat of a requisitioned vehicle. That was not a very good idea, and heading to a civilian medical facility was also going to be rather dangerous. Left with not a whole lot of options, however, he elected to go to a backstreet doctor, one Dr. Colding, or, well, doctor is perhaps a bit of a stretch, as he primarily handled, dead people, corpses, embalming procedures and so on, but hey, any port in a storm. And due to Mabon's remarkably resistant physiognomy, which, bearing in mind things we'll learn later, was still oddly weak, oh well, the Etogaur survived, and was able to reveal to Gaunt that the reason why the Blood Pact were able to track them so effectively was because they had a blood witch with them, a psyker specialized in the reading of blood and the tracking of anyone whose blood she possessed. And after the Etogaur had been wounded, she had his. Quite a bit of cat and mouse through the streets of Balhut followed, as somehow the witch psyker had managed to place a spell upon the city, causing the Imperium's response to be weirdly muted and dulled. It seemed impossible that a single psycho could have affected so much of the city so completely, but, well, there were other reasons for that as well, which we will get to in but a moment. Fortunately for the Colonel-Commissar, a group of Tanith, including dangerously high-ranking officers, had been out and about on a little bit of mischief, robbing a local criminal gang's gambling enterprises. Yeah, the whole thing about the Tanith not being a garrison force, that was, if anything, an understatement, as they had been actively causing a lot of trouble during their stay on the planet. But this turned out to be a blessing in disguise, as they were able to make contact with the rest of the Tanith and eventually the Colonel-Commissar. The Tanith regiment had been prevented from deploying in large scale due to agents of Inquisitor Rhyme having arrived to oversee things, just in case the Colonel-Commissar decided to reach out to them, because the Inquisition had now decided that it seemed awfully suspicious that Gaunt should effect an escape along with the prisoner and not immediately make contact with the Inquisition or the rest of the Imperium. Was he perhaps attempting to aid the prisoner in some way or some sort? Commissar Hark and Cadet Commissar Lud did not quite trust the inquisitorial agents, though, and worked with their own solutions to try and get a hold of Gaunt, which they eventually succeeded in. This was when the Inquisitor showed his other side, arriving alongside many other Imperial forces and the Tanith and the Blood Pact, resulting in a massive shootout, seeing the death of the rest of the Blood Pact infiltration unit. The Etogaur recognized the Inquisitor and named him Siko Magir, with Magir, of course, being a high rank within the Sons of Sek. This then goes quite some way to explain the dulled and muted response from the Imperial side. Not only were they being affected by the Blood Witch's magic, but the Inquisition had no doubt also put out a blanket restriction on the movement of Imperial troops, explaining that there was no need to fully mobilize the garrison or even activate PDF or local policing forces, that the Inquisition had everything well in hand. That hand being to recapture Prisoner B and either kill him or bring him back to the Archon for a little bit of re-education. I tell you, the Sabbat worlds are just a breeding ground for terrible Inquisitors. Here we have a turncoat Inquisitor straight up for the cause of chaos, or worse even still, a chaos operative that somehow has managed to infiltrate the Inquisition, gaining a hold of apparently a legitimate Rosetta whilst doing so. And this after we had another Inquisitor fetishize the vile Xenos Eldar to the point of joining them. I don't know what's in the water over in the Sabbat worlds, but it's clearly not good for the God Emperor's most devoted and holy of servants. Luckily, due to the efforts of the Colonel-Commissar and his regiment, the traitor was dispatched alongside the Blood Pact, and the asset was saved. As for the nature of his information, well, it was a rather intriguing gambit that he presented, which would also become the next mission for the Tanith first and only, after it now having become very obvious to everyone involved that Tanith were not going to sit happily on their asses without causing a lot of crime in the local area. It was necessary to get them somewhere else than a civilized center of commerce as quickly as possible. And the Etogaur presented just such an opportunity in an infiltration and destruction mission against a secret weapons research facility known as Salvation's Reach. A location that offered the opportunity to not just merely negatively impact the enemy's research efforts, but also an opportunity to drive a final wedge between Anakwana Sek and the Gaur. It was an extremely high-risk mission, deep behind enemy lines, with no guarantee whatsoever that the strike team would return. But if successful, the payoff could be tremendous. And hey, the Tanith were asking for a posting. Might as well accommodate their wishes. And as for the result of that operation, and the status of the wider front, we'll get to that again next week. Till then, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.